Can play transform your art? Could screwing around perhaps be the thing that unlocks those creative innovations that only you are capable of? That's what we're going to talk about today. I'm MVA Joshua. This is our vlog. Welcome to episode 91. So play is the topic of the day, but first we're going to talk a little bit about why it can be so hard to make new work for your design portfolio. This little chunky video is also going to show you how I plan and get ready for classes. This is improvised as I'm driving to work in the morning, and what I'm doing in this video is essentially delivering the opening remarks to a workshop on portfolio development. The way that I work is I will do something like this basically for weeks on end until I feel like I've got the class figured out. I don't write anything down, I just capture the structure. So that's first, and then chapters 2 and 3 get into this idea of play and instinct and accidental innovation. Enjoy. We definitely all go through these periods where we think that we need new or better work to get the things that we want career-wise, the opportunities or the clients or whatever. And the solution to that is to make more work. And I think there's a couple reasons why that is easier said than done. I think that it comes down to there are basic kind of impediments or frictions to just making a project. One of those is that a normal client project or a school project has a natural rhythm, and it has this third party that's involved with it, and that third party helps to create accountability, deliverables, all of that kinds of stuff. And when we're on our own with those things missing, the project can slip away from feeling real. Even if we just lay a set of deadlines right on top of it, it doesn't necessarily help. The other problem is that we all want to get somewhere that we weren't expecting to get to. We want a little bit of mystery or surprise. So when we don't have that structure in that external project, we come up with an idea, and very often we come up with the idea of what to do and the solution at the same time. And then we don't work on it. Maybe we start it, but we don't finish it. Maybe we never start it, and that we procrastinate on it. And I think the reason that we procrastinate on it is there's no real excitement to it. A situation that combats both of those things is that we decide that we'll find small free projects to do for people so that we can just do real projects. And one of the problems with that is there's a conflict. Are you doing this project for a person, or are you doing it to make your portfolio? You start to be of two minds with what you're doing, and you end up with what very often happens is that you've done this project. Maybe the person isn't going to use it because it feels so compromised from what they wanted, because they promised you creative freedom, but then they realize that they're not getting what they wanted and they don't use it. And then the other thing is that if you actually do what needs to be done on behalf of the client, maybe you ended up having to make compromises that cross the line to such an extent that it no longer feels like a portfolio project. Those are all realistic scenarios that can be undone so that you can develop new work. What we're going to talk about tonight is how to take the investment you've already put into your portfolio, into certain projects, and how to pull as much out of those projects as possible. And it doesn't matter whether they were client projects, it doesn't matter if they were things you did in school or free projects, and we're not talking about redesigning them either. We're simply talking about taking them to their logical extensions. Stare time. Let's talk about an artist. So in this intro to graphic design class that I'm teaching, we are using as our subject matter this concert series known as Meeting It Offsite that took place about 20 years ago in Japan. To say it's avant-garde is to put it very lightly. One of the key performers was this guitarist Toshimaru Nakamura, who by the time that they did the Meeting It Offsite series, he had pretty much given up on guitar. Because the first step of any design project should be research, one of the forms of research we did was listen to the music that came out of Offsite. So everything was free improv, and not in a jazz discipline, in a literally like people show up and play. So a bunch of these recordings have Toshimaru Nakamura playing the no input mixing board. So what he eventually did when he unplugged the guitar is he ran a line out of the mixing board and back into itself. So essentially he's mixing the sound of the machine. The recordings we listen to are actually really hard to listen to because Nakamura's contribution is this high pitch, piercing sound as he pulls the sound out and amplifies what's naturally coming out of the mixing board. At least in the recordings that we listened to yesterday, there's not a lot of anything else happening. It's just a tone that starts and ends or gets louder and quieter, but it's really difficult to listen to. So I read an interview with Nakamura, and he talked about why he put down the guitar and why he eventually unplugged it. And he basically said that over time, the physicality of the guitar became less interesting to him. He wanted to make sound, but he wasn't interested in playing the guitar so much. And eventually he started putting more effort into effects. And it finally got to this point where he's like almost totally still. He's got the guitar going into the mixing board and he's just like tapping it. And then finally one day he's like, whatever. And he just unplugs the guitar and he plugs the mixing board into itself. The sounds that he makes, at least circa 2000, 2001, at least in the Offsite recordings, are not super interesting. They're just high-pitched tones. As an example, the AV people at MCAD were convinced that something was wrong with the speakers, and they came in and they were like, do you hear that high-pitched tone? And I was like, yeah, we're listening to that. And he's like, no, I mean the high-pitched tone. Like, yeah, the high-pitched tone is the music. And they refused to believe me. But there was something about the activity and the output that was compelling and engrossing to him. This morning, I listened to an album of his called Reverb. In parentheses, it's No Input Mixing Board number 8. So his 8th album collecting material made this way. And it's great. It's rhythmic. It's still highly computerized sounding and inorganic. But from playing with this bizarre instrument or turning this tool into an instrument and playing with it over the course of almost 20 years, it's a decidedly musical instrument. Now, it's not the kind of thing I'm going to rock all the time in the car, but it was definitely cool to listen to today. And one of the things is that knowing what the tool is becomes even more interesting, because you're like, this is just coming out of a mixing board that's like just looping on itself. Like, fascinating. Why I bring this up and what I find fascinating about it is the idea that he hit this point where the thing he'd been doing for a long time was no longer gratifying or compelling. And what he decided to do was to experiment with that. And then he found this new form that felt right. Now, maybe when he heard those sine waves, he was like, oh my God, that's awesome. Who knows? Maybe he's the kind of person who was like, oh my God, that's the most irritating thing I've ever heard, and was entertained by it. I have no idea. but he continued to play with this thing, and this musical contribution comes out of it. Doing things the right way, learning the established ways of doing them, all of that stuff is not necessarily important, because the contribution is very often going to come from you following your bizarre and potentially demented instincts and seeing where they go and mastering the things that you feel compelled to do or play with. The hardest thing about the teaching, or the way that I've been doing it, is trying to get people to play. I think that's what all my effort has been going into as of late, is I just want people to let go and try stuff. And it's so hard to get people to do. It doesn't matter how old or how young or how experienced or how inexperienced. Getting people on that, like, just move fast and try a lot of stuff program, super difficult. If you are self-motivated, if you play and you don't worry about a goal and you don't overthink what am I going to do next, you don't need teachers. Like, most of what I'm trying to do is to make it to where everyone can teach themselves. Because all the greats in whatever field, it always comes down to play and kind of fearless experimentation. And I'll pull this back to myself, and I hope that one person, one of you watching this, flips the switch and goes hard on experimentation. So just now I'm coming out of this intro to graphic design class, and today was typography day. I gave them all their content. We did a little demo on Illustrator. Only a few of them had used Illustrator. And then we just started working through taking that content and organizing it and playing with it. And we did that for maybe 2 hours or something. And then we took a little break and we came back to our content, and we took just the name of the event, which was called Offsite in America. We just played with making versions of that thing, what I tend to call the visual anchor, potentially the most important content on this poster. And I do these kinds of assignments. If I wasn't so stoked on the fact that I can get home at a reasonable time, I would have stayed and worked on it for another hour. When I get into play mode and I play, and I consider it a blessing to be able to just try stuff. So what I noticed a couple years ago, so I'd run these workshops with my students, and a couple things would happen. One, I could tell that their work was improving within really short time frames, just through iteration and building on top of whatever we had done a half hour ago. But then the other thing that would happen is, if I was able to partake in the workshop, which, like, very often I do, that I would just be like, man, this is rad. This is just how I should work. I'd find that using a method that fell outside the normal research, come up with a concept, execute a concept, when I got out of that mode, oftentimes I liked the work that came out of it better than the ordinary normal work. And I'd see it with the students too. I'd give them these very simple parameters, but then also tell them, don't worry about making good work. And they would make work that was so much more visual or so much more interesting than when they were trying to be interesting. I got a whole video coming that's all about the idea of how could you teach yourself design and what kind of assignments you need to do. But there's an opportunity cost with chasing an idea or chasing a concept. It takes so much more time to wrangle an idea or a concept into the thing that you have in your head, or the ideal that you have for it, than it does to try a whole bunch of stuff. And yet it's like in the trying a whole bunch of stuff that all the things you hadn't thought about come to the forefront, and all the options you wouldn't have thought were possible or likely, that stuff all comes through. I look at my own work habits over the last 4 years, and I see this thing where I've gotten to places I couldn't anticipate because of the fact that essentially I was screwing around and following my own interests. Here's an idea that I want to make really clear and palpable. You've already seen videos where I talk about the inherent weakness of my process. And it wasn't just the inherent weakness of my process, it was the inherent weakness of my mindset and my approach. I was doubly hobbled by the belief that you had to have an idea to make a project, and that it had to be a good idea, and by the fact that I didn't have a process to make ideas. This double whammy of shittiness. And then I had all these beliefs about what constituted good work. I still have beliefs like that, but they've chilled out. And then there's this other aspect to it, which is this idea of just generalized creative work. And I've always had this impulse to make stuff, but it has always been frustrating. So I can look across whatever, like I could go dig up sketchbooks right now that are filled with ideas for things to make that I never made. And sometimes I've gotten very clear and very close on like, okay, this is the idea, this is the type of execution, I just need to track down, not even track down, I just need to go and do this, and this, and then I'm straight. This thing is happening.
Hello, welcome to Starbucks. How's it going today?
Good, how are you?
Doing well, thank you. What can I get started for you?
Can I get 2 tall decaf iced lattes?
Anything else?
That's it.
Alrighty, that'll be 702.
Cool, thanks. So I've always had this impulse to make stuff. I've always had these to-do lists of art projects that I could do, and painting series and image series, and like sometimes I'd get as far as a sketch, but a lot of times they wouldn't come to fruition. And they didn't come to fruition not because they're bad ideas. They don't come to fruition because I procrastinate on things that aren't a form of play, which I did not realize. It took me so long. I thought that I procrastinated because I was lazy or self-sabotaging or ideas like that, but it mostly turned out that I had taken the activity that should be fun, graphic design, art, whatever, and I had turned it into more work, and then I didn't do it. What I realized was happening, and it took a long time. You know, I'm like 42, and it took like 42 years to figure this out. I have these photos on my Instagram called abstractions. They're these gelatinous, blurry photos, whatever. Those photos come out of this process of collecting plastic bags filled with non-food trash, basically. It's like anything that doesn't go in the compost and isn't so gross that it needs to go in the trash goes in a plastic bag, like a bread bag, and so it'll be filled with other plastic bags and with candy packaging and toy packaging and broken crayons and whatever else. So I'd fill up the bag and I tie it off, and then I just, using my iPhone, I take photos of that thing and I make videos and do all this crap. And then I make these cool images that are unbelievably appealing to me, but there's no idea behind them. And what they came out of were 2 fairly asinine forms of creative activity that I didn't consider art. One was that every time I go out to eat, if there's 2 or 3 glasses on the table, I'm sitting there screwing around with the glasses to photograph the light passing through them. A very generic thing that kind of everybody does that's like a creative person. And then the other thing was that before we had composting, I hated putting stuff in the trash. So if there was like a container, whether it was a coffee cup or half of an avocado shell, any trash from that meal I would stuff into this thing. So it might be like an ice cream container, and it's filled with straws and weird stuff. And I would take a photo of it, and I'd post it to Instagram with the hashtag garbage sculpture, and no one liked them except for me. Thank you. Thanks. Have a good one. You too. So you have these 2 things going on. They introduced composting in Minneapolis, so a lot of what was going into these things now had a place to go. So I needed a new solution for the problem of there was still this trash, and it started going into plastic bags. I honestly don't remember why. Just one day I had a bread bag and I started putting stuff in it. But I was sat on the couch and I took a bunch of photos of it, and I was like, huh. And the confluence of all these like minor asinine activities was making this discovery that a bag that was filled with stuff like the Reese's peanut butter cup wrappers and filled with cleared weird chunks of plastic was a very viable source for image making. But the thing that I realized was between the abstractions, the landscape photography, and the Twitter project was that in my entire life since like art school, I never considered myself an artist. And now I had this viewpoint like, oh, I'm an artist. I make art. And these are the things I do. And what I also noticed was that during that time, I still had ideas for like art projects, but I wouldn't do them. But then this other stuff that I didn't take seriously, but that I loved and that I didn't procrastinate on, and that I generated volumes of material, that was my art practice. What that's caused for me is to look for those kinds of qualities across the board, to look for ways of making things that I can be serious about, but ways of making them so fun that I procrastinate on other stuff like eating or doing real art or going to sleep. Like I know it's a good sign if I can procrastinate on going to sleep. That's the best. And this is obviously highly personal. The play quality is like an artistic philosophy. It's a necessary feature of the operating system. Like shit's not happening without it. So then I realized like, okay, cool. I can play all day, but then I can look at the results I get in a classroom and know that at the very least, play should be an aspect of any designer's workflow. Even if it's on the level of just staying sharp, it should be a part of what you do. And I kind of look at it like this. I know that I'm not the only teacher anyone is having. So I try to go on whatever it is I'm doing as a teacher. I'm trying to get out on the limb. I'm trying to make sure there's a high degree of contrast and a fundamentally different approach than other teachers. That's the goal. Because before I was like everybody else, except that I don't know, I swore a lot and used NWA's studio sessions as the parable about work that day. I think where I'm at now is that I'm trying to give an approach that I think will honestly make you better. And I don't think you have to take it to the extreme that I take it, but I think you have to get enough of a taste for it to see the results. I spend way too much time trying to explain, like, I hope that you see the results, because I'm seeing them. Like, I'm looking at what you got done in 42 minutes, and that should not be possible. But it is what happens when you chill out on the goals and the being smart and the having a style and all that stuff, and then you just go like, I have a material. What can I do with the material? If you've seen this vlog, like, we talk about workflow and process a lot, which is a super helpful thing. But if you're in an environment and you can't fix the workflow or the process, and you keep doing everything it takes to do the best job possible, you're gonna create this messed up situation for yourself. You're gonna be pissed off, especially when you're staying at work till 10 p.m. to fix things that never needed to be broken in the first place. And you can tell, obviously, that I have experience with this.